Bonjour, je m'appelle Giorgio Shani, je suis un ami de professeur Baer, est un professeur de relations internationales à l'Université chrétienne internationale à Japon. Aujourd'hui, je vais vous présenter les relations internationales post-occidentales. Dozo yoroshiku onegai shimasu, as we say within Japan. I would now like to share with you my PowerPoint slides. So please look at them. I hope you will be able to see them. So today I have been asked to talk about post-Western international relations. This is ostensibly based on an article I wrote in 2008 called Towards a Post-Western IR. And it attempted to critically engage with critical international relations theory by bringing in discussions of universality and particularity from two non-Western religious traditions, Islam and Sikhism. Now, my thinking, along with Professor Baer, has been further developed throughout the intervening decade and a half since I first wrote the article. So I will attempt to update the main points which I make in the article after summarizing them. So please note that my lecture today, or my talk today, does not correspond literally or exactly to the article upon which it is based. Okay, by way of introduction, I will show you how I'm going to structure the lecture. We'll start with an argument, so you can switch off after you've heard the argument. This will be a summary of what I am going to say in the lecture and the main points of the reading. I will very briefly introduce critical international relations and then look at the critique from non-Western international relations, particularly the critique of Amitav Acharya and Barry Bazan, who now are seen as leading advocates of global international relations. And I'll be returning to global international relations in the conclusion. I will then walk you through the postcolonial critique of non-Western international relations before introducing you to post-Western international relations. Now, I should point out that my own position may be seen as based on an immanent critique in a critical theoretical sense of post-colonialism. So it is a position which arises from an engagement of the post-colonial critique of non-Western international relations and a post-colonial critique of critical international relations. However, there are some differences between my position and the position of most, I would say, orthodox, although it's a contradiction in terms, post-colonial theorists. So I'll spend some time explaining what I understand by post-Western international relations. Now, one term which I did not use in the 2008 article, but which would possibly help clarify my position and also clarify the unease with post-colonial theory and its engagement with international relations, is the term cosmology. I did not explicitly use this term in the article. However, in the article which I wrote for Millennium with Professor Baer, we explicitly used the term cosmologies. And I think this is important because within the article, I am referring to what are seen as two religious traditions, Islam, and later we'll see Sikhism. So when we look at Islam, the central concept, which I wanted to expand upon and wanted to introduce the audience to, was the concept of the Umma, the universal community of believers. Now, Islam can be seen as a self-consciously religious tradition. It is an Abrahamic tradition. It has its roots within the Abrahamic traditions, which go back to Judaism through Christianity. So perhaps the term religion can be applied to Islam, but I would say that Islam is more than a religion. Islam can be seen as a cosmology or a variety of different cosmologies which intersect and within and allow us to view the world through an Islamic prism or an Islamic frame. Now, my main area of research is on Sikhism, or the Sikh cosmological tradition, which can be called Sikhi. Now, the community of believers, which is closely based on the idea of the Umma, is called the Khalsa, the community here of the pure. But there are very big differences here between the Umma and the Khalsa. And one of them has to do with the idea of sovereignty. So within Sikhism, the Khalsa is seen as both temporally and spiritually a sovereign body. So if we look at the correct term to describe the community of believers within Sikhism, this can be seen as the Khalsa Panth. So the Khalsa is this religious community of the pure. The Panth here are the followers of the first guru of Sikhism, Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism. So what I try to do within the article is to introduce the idea of the Khalsa Panth to an international relations audience. And my reason for doing so, which it's not explicitly stated, although I think is implicit in the article, is that when I was doing my doctoral research on Sikh nationalism in the University of London, I was told by international relations professors, why should we be interested in the Sikhs? So this, in a way, was my answer to that question. I was trying to say that Sikhism, or rather Sikhi, the cosmological tradition of Sikhi, has something to contribute to international relations, and that it is, in fact, the structure of international relations itself, particularly in its conventional iterations, based on a Westphalian understanding of international relations, which does not allow the voices of Sikh people to be heard, or the Sikh cosmological tradition to be heard. Now, what I would like to suggest in the conclusion is that the way forward, if we are to further develop and institutionalize post-Western international relations, would be to work with the concept of cosmology as the basic unit of international relations, and to examine the possibilities for a plurilogue of cosmologies, or a pluriversal dialogue of cosmologies. In the final slide, I'll be introducing the concept of the pluriverse. But the idea of the plurilogue, which is an idea which Professor Baer and myself had in an article which we published, a short article which we published earlier this year, looks at a multivocal and transformative conversation between different cosmologies. Okay, so this would be an overview of my talk. Let me proceed on to the argument. Now, the argument is, I would say, relatively simple and relatively straightforward. It is firstly that critical international relations continues to speak for and to the West. I think today this is not as controversial as it was when I wrote the article in 2008. And certainly even at that time, there were other scholars who were making similar points. Many of them were post-colonial scholars. Examples would include the work of Sankaran Krishna, also of John Hobson, whose work on the Eurocentrism of international relations has particular resonance, I would say, today. Mustafa Kemal Pasha and others made the point that critical international relations was a Eurocentric theory of international relations. By using and critically engaging with the work of Dipesh Chakrabarty, I show in the article how critical IR is dependent upon a secular form of historicism, which basically reproduces colonial hierarchies. So the main argument I'm making in the article is that a post-Western critical international relations, and I think this is important. I'm not really trying to articulate just what a post-Western international relations would be, but specifically a post-Western critical IR. So it's an immanent critique of critical international relations. So a post-Western critical IR would seek to identify critical discourses from different traditions. In the article, I looked at different religious traditions or different transnational communities. However, I think the appropriate term would be different cosmological traditions. And I'll be defining and explaining my understanding of cosmology later in the lecture. These critical discourses are often articulated in religious terms, as the distinction between the secular and religious is specific to Western cosmological traditions. By Western cosmological traditions, I'm specifically looking at the Judeo-Christian tradition, where we have, certainly in the case of Christianity, the concept of the secular arises from the religious tradition itself. The term secular referred to lay monks. It now refers to a domain which is different from the religious. Within the West, I would, and I was greatly influenced by, and I would strongly recommend you to read Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, which looks at 500 years of the Western tradition, the transformation within Latin Christendom from an age in which belief in God was axiomatic and taken for granted to our present secular age, where a belief in God or a belief in religion is one possible position. So what Taylor does is show the transformation within that tradition itself. However, I and many other scholars who are influenced by postcolonialism would argue that what Taylor doesn't do is take into account the interaction of Latin Christendom with the rest of the world. So the 500 years in which Latin Christendom was transformed was also the age of empire, the age in which Latin Christendom became globalized and encountered others through the process of colonization, obviously subjugated others as well. Okay, So this is the main argument which I make within the article. You all will probably be familiar with the orthodoxy of Westphalian international relations. So international relations as an academic discipline is based on a myth of a reading of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which brought to an end the 30 Years' War, which was a religious war between Protestant and Catholic principalities. So if we look at Westphalian international relations, the dominant framing of geocultural difference is through the territorialized sovereign state. The state is seen as sovereign. So the main form of geographical difference is the territorialized state. And the argument within international relations is that each state has its own culture within international relations. Now, we know that this is not true, that all societies, I would argue, throughout the world are multicultural in that they consist of different peoples who practice different cultures. However, within international relations, there is a homogenization and essentialization of culture and its attachment to the territorialized state. So we talk in terms of China as a state, not as a culture. Chinese culture is the culture which is attributed to the People's Republic of China. And the assumption is that this culture is different from Japanese culture, which is the culture which is attributed to the state of Japan. Okay, as you'll be familiar with Professor Baer's lecture, international relations is based on this binary opposition between a sovereign inside and anarchic outside. So the anarchic outside, the idea of anarchy, affords international relations a structure, but it also acts as a constitutive outside for the sovereign state. It creates sovereign states. The idea of anarchy creates sovereignty within. And this refers, of course, to the work of Rob Walker. Now, again, if we were to look at mainstream realist and neo-realist understandings of international relations, we have a system of states in which states form an anarchical system through interaction. It is anarchy which socializes states and which makes conflict inevitable, if we are to use Walz's theory of international politics. If we're to look at the English school, as in opposition to neo-realist orthodoxy, then the main argument here is we live in a society of states where states are bound by common values and institutions. So this is refers specifically to the work of Hedley Bull and Martin White and others. And I think the importance of Bull is he influences the views of Barry Buzan and Amitav Acharya, particularly in his collaboration with Adam Watson in the expansion of international society. Okay, let us move toward critical international relations. I assume you've already had lectures on critical international relations, so I'll just briefly summarize the argument before summarizing what I consider to be important for critical IR. So critical international relations, by examining the origins, development, and potential transformation of the bounded territorial state, has created space within the discipline of international relations for the articulation of challenges from outside the West. So it doesn't take the state as axiomatic. It shows the sociological and historical processes through which the territorialized state emerged. And it also shows the possibility of change. So to quote Marx, as many critical theorists do, the purpose is, well, to paraphrase Marx, the purpose of world history, of philosophy, is not to interpret the world in many different ways, as philosophers have done, but to change it. So there's a commitment here to changing the international system, which is composed of sovereign states, and to moving towards a different form of political community, which is more inclusive of difference. However, the argument which I make in the article, which is borrowed from the critique of Dipesh Chakrabarty and his critique of Marxism, or Western understandings of Marxism, is that the secular Eurocentric historicism of critical theory and its attachment to universal enlightened values of freedom and equality places limits on the degree to which, I use the term, non-Western transnational communities. But I think the logic of my argument is that there can be no non-West because we live in a post-Western world. So there is not, there's no pristine culture or pristine cosmology which has not been impacted by the colonial encounter. So I prefer the term post-West to non-West, and I would argue that non-West does not make a great deal of sense. But at least it places limits. The argument here is that the Eurocentrism of critical IR places limits on the degree to which post-Western actors can participate in international relations. Just in case you are not familiar with critical theory, I am really looking at the use by Robert Cox of the distinction made by Horkheimer between traditional and critical theory. So traditional theory, according to Cox's understanding of Horkheimer, are theories which try and explain how the world works within prevailing power structures. This is very much what neorealism does. So traditional theory for Cox was a problem-solving theory employed by hegemonic social forces, whereas critical theory attempts to change the world by looking for the possibilities for liberation that are immanent, that are latent within existing political and social relations. And within this lecture, I'm taking an immanent critique. This is an immanent critique of critical IR and also of post-colonial and non-Western IR. Of importance also is the work of Andrew Linklater, who is now very heavily influenced by the work of Norbert Elias. But at the time of his path-breaking work, The Transformation of Political Community, introduced to international relations Jürgen Habermas's idea of discourse ethics, which translates in Linklater's terms to equal rights to participate in a dialogue to determine the principles of inclusion and exclusion which govern global politics. So the argument I make is this creates the possibility of going beyond the West in IR and engaging with other cosmologies. However, what is particularly evident in the work of Andrew Linklater is a commitment to some form of historicism. So historicism can be seen in the works of, in the words of Dipesh Chakrabarty, as a mode of thinking, which tells us that in order to understand the nature of anything in this world, we must see it as a historically developing entity. That is, first as an individual, first as an individual and unique, and second as something that develops over time. And historicism can be traced back specifically to Hegelian understandings here of time and Hegelian understandings of dialectical processes. Now, for Chakrabarty, the problem with historicism is that it assumes the existence of a single universalizing narrative of modernity and cannot countenance the existence of alternative modes of temporality, each with its own concept here of the political. So the denial of what Chakrabarty terms heterotemporality, the existence of many times, of understandings of times, renders post-colonial peoples effectively peoples without history. And this was the way in which Hegel viewed the peoples in India, within China, and the way Marxists look at as the Asiatic mode of production as a form of Oriental despotism. So this, in a way, illustrates how historicism creates a system where emancipation is only possible for those who are at a more advanced level than others. And these are generally people who live within the developed West. Now, this article, the main object of critique in the introduction of the article is the non-Western international relations theory of Amitabh Acharya and Barry Bazan, which is now metamorphized into global international relations. So Acharya and Bazan argued that international relations theory is produced by and for the West and rests on an assumption that Western history is world history. They argued that if we are to improve international relations theory as a whole, then Western IRT needs to be challenged not just from within, but also from outside the West. Now, I agree with them on this point. However, along with post-colonial theorists, I do not agree with the concept of non-Western international relations. And in their book and in their special issue for international relations in Asia Pacific, Amitabh Acharya and Barry Bazan basically reproduce a Westphalian imaginary. So you have a Chinese international relations theory, which is based on the Chinese state, an Indian international relations theory, which is based on the Indian state, and so on and so forth. So this is basically taking a Westphalian map of the world and attributing a particular view of international relations to that state, in the same way as the English school has been basically territorialized. So as post-colonial theorists would say, this ignores the constitutive role of colonialism in the making of international relations, West and non-West. So post-colonialists would say that there is no non-West because the non-West has been colonized by the West, and the ideas of statehood, of sovereignty, of the individual were all disseminated as a result of colonial apparatuses of education, which were only made possible by coercion. Also, Bazan and Acharya talk in terms of they're looking specifically at Asian traditions. Non-Western international relations or Asian international relations is seen as pre-theoretical. It's not seen as highly advanced and developed as Western international relations theory. So this reinforces the Orientalism and provincialism. Orientalism referring to the work of Edward Said, in which discourses on the Orient construct the Orient itself, and the idea of provincialism of Chakrabarty. Provincialism here is he's saying, look, the entire Western tradition and Western conception of modernity are basically the conceptions of modernity which have arisen from Europe. They're not universal, despite its claims. So non-Western approaches to international relations are seen as mere mimicry of Western discourses. Here I'm referring specifically to the work of Partha Chatterjee in his work on nationalism as a derivative discourse. So the argument here is that non-Western approaches are seen as basically mimicking Western discourses. The attachment to state sovereignty, for example, is seen as basically a mimicry here of Western discourses of it, or as local variations of Western ideas which have acquired theoretical status in the academy. Okay, now what I try to do in the article is to attempt an immanent critique of postcolonialism. The problem with postcolonialism, as we'll see towards the end, is it cannot articulate an alternative to international relations. It can't do so because the recovery of the subaltern voice is seen as impossible, given the totalizing nature of Orientalist and colonial discourses. So if we look specifically at Spivak's work, and which is very influential within not only postcolonial studies, but also feminism, on Can the Subaltern Speak? She shows how the subaltern here, the subaltern woman, can only speak through certain discourses which are made available to her by patriarchy and by colonialism. However, I think I find the argument that the subaltern cannot speak to be unsatisfactory. What this does within the context of international relations is to ignore non-Western or post-Western conceptions of international relations. So postcolonialism is great as a critique of the Eurocentrism of international relations theory. And now, if we look at decolonial perspectives of the racism of international relations theory and its imbrication here in structures, colonial structures of power. But it can provide, postcolonialism can provide no alternative to Western international relations theory, because by doing so, you are seen as becoming a native informant, and you're seen as reproducing the hierarchy of the West. So what this does, in a way, is to basically silence the rest of the world. So international relations is a Western discourse. You have a post-colonial critique of these Western discourses, but you can have no international relations outside of the West. And this seems to me not only unsatisfactory at the level normatively, but also empirically. There are discourses on the international from non-Western or post-Western traditions, or from, more specifically, from different cosmological traditions. So a post-Western international relations, I argue, would attempt to go beyond questioning the meta-theoretical assumptions of Western IR and examine different understandings of universality and particularity. In order to do so, there needs to be serious engagement with different cosmologies. Now, what do I mean by cosmology? Remember, of course, this is not within the paper. So cosmologies refer, in the words of Emilia Kirke, primarily to the beliefs that people, society, or religions have of the ordered nature of the cosmos, of how they believe the world to be structured. Scientific cosmologies, particularly if we look at the work of Bentley Allen, he's written a book on scientific cosmologies, are, in my view, and also the view of Hartmut Baer, influenced by cultural and religious cosmologies. There is no universal distinction which can be made between the sacred and the profane. I should also point out that this also looks at the work which I've done with Navneet Chadha on provincializing international relations through Dharma. So we make the same point. Scientific cosmologies are influenced by cultural and religious cosmologies. So cosmologies link theories of origins with a set of thick normative political and moral claims which offer the possibility of going beyond what is. This comes through the Millennium article, which Hartmut Baer and myself published last year. Now, getting back to the original International Studies Review article of 2008, I don't use the term cosmology when I look at the Umma. However, I am engaging with Islamic traditions and saying that the Islamic cosmological tradition or the Islamic cosmological traditions have something to say to international relations. And more importantly, Islamic cosmological traditions also have something to say to critical international relations, because critical discourses can be identified from within Islam. So the Ummah refers to the community of believers made equal in their submission to Allah. It rejects the concept of the Ummah, rejects the limits of the nation state, defined in terms of language, ethnicity, race, and citizenship. So it's a transnational community. Now, if we look at the governance here of the Ummah, we can make a distinction here between what Sardar calls the Sharia, which he, using specifically the terms of Robert Cox, sees as a problem-solving institution, way of providing jurisprudence and order within society, and the latitude which is given to ijtihad, to critical reasoning within the Islamic tradition. So within international relations, the argument is critical IR, Western critical IR, needs to engage with critical discourses within Islam. Instead, it basically caricatures Islam in historicist terms as a static civilization or a static religion, which particularly I was writing in the aftermath of the war on terror and the invasion and occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. Caricatures of Islam and Orientalist stereotypes of Islam were seen to facilitate continued American and Western occupation of Islamic societies in order to create the conditions for the emergence of liberal democracies. So I'm saying instead there needs to be an engagement with Islamic cosmological traditions, and particularly with critical discourses from inside these cosmological traditions. So the argument I make is that the Ummah can possibly be seen as a post-Westphalian community. Now, it can't technically be seen as a post-Westphalian community because the Ummah precedes the Peace of Westphalia. It has been there ever since you had the expansion here of Islam. Wherever there's Muslims, there is an Ummah. But the argument here is that, particularly if we look at the work of Andrew Linklater and the way in which He is arguing that we are moving towards, we're transitioning, political community is changing from the nation state, which is based on the principle of exclusion, excluding people who are not members of your nation state, towards a higher form of political community. And he identifies this within the European Union at the time, the potential for Westphalian communities. Well, no need to look at the European Union. You can look at the Umma for what a post-Westphalian community could look like. So this gives us a different conception of universality and particularity than Western international relations. So universality here is the idea of the Umma, particularity is the idea of the Watan or the homeland. Now, I wrote this article before the formation and development of the Islamic State, of IS. Now, I think it is important to note that the Islamic State, at least in the Western translation of the term, if we look at the Islamic State, it tries to restore an understanding of the caliphate, but this becomes territorialized in the idea of a state. So ideas of the Islamic State would be contradictory to Islamic teachings because you cannot have an Islamic state. A state refers to a watan, a homeland, whereas if Islam refers to the religion of those people who submit to Allah, who form the Ummah. So we're conflating here, if we look at the Islamic State, we're conflating, confusing ideas of the Ummah and the Watan. We're confusing the idea of a transnational community of believers with the idea of a nation state. So the Islamic State, in this sense, can be seen as a mimicry, a derivative discourse of Western international relations based on a Westphalian imaginary. Okay, now, although most of you will be familiar, of course, due to your location in France, with Islam, Islam is the second most popular religion within France and arguably within Europe as a whole. You may not be familiar with Sikhi or Sikhism. If you look at my virtual background, this is a Gurdwara, which is a Sikh temple in Delhi. Now, Sikhs are originally from the province of the former British province of the Punjab. So they are Punjabis ethnically and speak the language Punjabi. However, their religion is universal and in many sense is committed to a form of radical egalitarianism, which brought Sikhs into tension or conflict, not only with Hindus, but also with Muslims. Now, although the tradition begins with the first Guru, Guru Nanak, in the 16th century, the key term which I try to introduce, the key concept, which I introduce in the article in 2008, is the idea of the Khalsa Panth. And the reason I'm introducing it is that the Khalsa Panth gives a different understanding of universality and particularity. This tension, which we've looked at within Islam, between the Ummah and the Watan. So the Khalsa refers specifically to the 10th and last Guru, Guru Gobind Singh. Guru Gobind Singh inaugurated the Khalsa, and he basically argued, or he said, that his followers would become the Guru. So in a way, if we look at our understandings of sovereignty, as existed within Europe at the time, the sovereign was a person. It was a king or a queen. This is before the French Revolution. However, the argument is a century before the French Revolution. We have, with Guru Gobind Singh, the institution of the Khalsa, where through the idea of the Guru Panth, he creates his followers as a sovereign religio-political community. So within Sikhism, you have spiritual and temporal dimensions of the Guru's authority invested in the Khalsa Panth, this community of the pure. So the Khalsa Panth is seen as a sovereign community, and this sovereignty is embedded in the external symbols of Sikh identity. So if you see Sikhs, I mean, this is mainly gendered, but not exclusively so. You'll find that most Sikhs wear turbans. Now, the turban is not a religious symbol. The turban is used in order to keep the hair. Hair is meant to be kept long. That is a religious symbol. Hairs, including facial hair. You have steel bangles and other external symbols, including a ceremonial sword, the kirpan, which shows that Sikhs, wherever they are, form a sovereign community in a religio-political sense. And the idea here is that there's no contradiction or distinction between being a Sikh and, let's say, being an Indian, or being a Canadian, or being a French person. You can be French and Sikh at the same time, although French laws do not allow Sikhs in universities, at least until recently, to wear turbans, because it's seen as an ostensible religious symbol. So my main point of introducing the Khalsa Panth is to look at the idea of embodied sovereignty as a different conception of sovereignty from the territorialized sovereignty of the Peace of Westphalia. And the argument here is there should be some engagement between critical international relations and the tradition of Sikhi, or at least critical discourses within Sikhi. Okay, by way of conclusion, what Professor Baer and myself attempt to do in our Millennium article of last year, 2001, is, and specifically in an article, a shorter article in EIR published this year, is to show the way forward. So how can Postwestern IR further develop? So the argument here is that there should be a global dialogue between cosmologies. And in order for this to happen, there needs to be thick and thin normativity. So thick normativity refers to universal emancipatory claims articulated within different cosmological registers. Thin normativity refers to a commitment to keeping the space for dialogue open based on a critical engagement with other thick normative claims. Now, basically, the main argument we make is a pluralogue is only possible and is constitutive of a pluriverse. So if we live in a universe where there are universal values which apply to everybody, then we don't necessarily need a pluralogue, because it would lead to agreement on these universal values. But our starting point is based on the idea of difference. So different here, different conceptions of universality, not difference as articulated only within particularity. So pluriverse is based on the premise that we inhabit different cosmologies, each with their own understanding of universality. These cosmologies collide, intersect, and become enmeshed with one another. So we live in this pluriverse of entangled universes rather than one universe. So we're borrowing this term from Arturo Escobar, Walter Mignolo, and decolonial scholars. Okay, so by way of conclusion, what I've attempted to argue is that critical international relations is inherently Eurocentric due to its historicism. Most attempts to go beyond the West, particularly non-Western international relations, remain trapped within a Westphalian straitjacket, which constrains the expressions of cosmological difference. A post-Western approach should decenter the state and the Westphalian order by engaging with different conceptions of universality and particularity. So therefore, it should be pluriversal, based on a plural universalities rather than a pluralistic account of a single universality, as in global international relations, as put forward by Amitabh Charity and Barry Bazan. And that thick and thin normativity are both needed as conditions for pluriversal dialogue. Thin normativity to counter exclusionary claims by keeping the space for dialogue open. Okay, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for listening. I referred to, of course, my article Towards a Post-Western International Relations, the Umma, Khalsa Panth, and Critical International Relations Theory, and also articles which I've co-authored with Hartmut Baer, Rethinking Emancipation in a Critical IR, Normativity, Cosmology, and Pluriversal Dialogue, published in Millennium last year, and Rethinking Critical IR Towards a Plurilogue of Cosmologies. This is a shorter version of the article where we introduce the concept of plurilogue. Okay, merci beaucoup. Au revoir.